What happens when a simple question on live TV pushes Brad Pitt past his breaking point? What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, and a segment that begins as a standard celebrity interview slowly shifts into something far more uncomfortable than anyone in the studio anticipated? Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. On this particular morning, the atmosphere on set felt typical for a weekday broadcast. The panel was seated around the table, the studio audience energized but calm, and the segment was introduced as a straightforward interview with Brad Pitt, who is appearing to promote his latest film project and discuss his ongoing work as a producer. The tone at the top of the segment was relaxed. The hosts offered their usual mix of warm welcome and light humor. Brad entered to applause, smiling politely, offering a wave, and taking his seat at the far end of the table. From the beginning, the conversation flowed easily. The first few questions focused on his recent film work, the challenges of producing versus acting, and how he balances creative projects. The hosts leaned in, nodding, occasionally laughing. The audience responded in kind, applauding at appropriate moments. It felt exactly like the kind of polished, promotional appearance viewers have come to expect. As is common on daytime talk shows, the tone shifted gradually toward more personal territory. The hosts transitioned from professional topics to broader discussions about growth, public scrutiny, and resilience. Brad responded thoughtfully, choosing his words carefully. He spoke about learning from experience and maintaining perspective. There was nothing tense yet, just the normal rhythm of live television conversation. Then Sunny Hostin entered the discussion with a slightly more pointed question. Her delivery remained calm and measured, but the substance of the question was noticeably different from the earlier, lighter prompts. She referenced past public controversies and asked Brad how he reconciles public accountability with personal growth. Her phrasing was direct but not hostile. It reflected the style she often brings to serious discussions, informed, specific, and grounded in broader social themes. The shift in the energy around the table was subtle, but perceptible. Brad's posture straightened slightly. His smile tightened, not disappearing entirely, but becoming more controlled. The other hosts glanced briefly toward Sunny, then back at Brad, as if anticipating a careful response. He began answering in a composed tone. He acknowledged that being in the public eye comes with scrutiny and that people are entitled to opinions. He emphasized the importance of private reflection and personal change. For a moment, it appeared the conversation would continue in a measured way. But Sunny followed up. Her second question drilled a bit deeper. She referenced how public figures often speak about growth, yet audiences sometimes feel that accountability conversations are avoided or minimized. She asked directly whether he believed he had been fully transparent in addressing past issues. The studio grew quieter. It wasn't silent, but the background murmur faded. Viewers at home could likely sense the shift just from body language alone. One of the co-hosts attempted a light interjection, perhaps to soften the tension, but Sunny continued her line of inquiry. Brad paused longer before responding this time. He clasped his hands together on the table. His eyes briefly lowered, then returned to Sunny. His tone remained calm, but it carried a firmer edge. He said that personal matters involving family and private relationships deserve boundaries. He reiterated that growth is ongoing and doesn't always happen publicly. Sunny nodded, but didn't retreat. She clarified that her question wasn't about invading privacy, but about the broader cultural conversation surrounding accountability, especially when public figures influence millions of people. Her voice remained steady, but the persistence of the question made it clear she wasn't going to pivot away easily. The other hosts began subtly shifting in their seats. One tried to redirect toward the film again, asking about a particular scene that dealt with redemption. The attempt felt transparent, a gentle attempt to steer the segment back to safer territory. But the earlier question was still hanging in the air. Brad responded to the film-related question briefly, then circled back. He said he respected thoughtful dialogue, but felt the conversation was starting to move into personal, legal, and family territory that he wasn't prepared to litigate on daytime television. His wording was careful, but his facial expressions signaled discomfort. The audience reaction was mixed. A few scattered murmurs, some supportive applause when he mentioned respecting privacy. But there was also a sense of collective anticipation, as if everyone understood this was no longer just a promotional segment. Sunny, maintaining professionalism, clarified again that her intention was not to litigate personal matters, but to ask about public responsibility. She referenced how conversations about power and accountability have evolved in recent years and asked whether he sees himself as part of that evolving dialogue. At this point, the exchange had clearly shifted from standard celebrity promotion to a substantive and increasingly tense discussion. The pacing slowed. The smiles faded. Even the lighting seemed harsher in the stillness. Brad leaned back slightly in his chair. His response was measured, but firmer than before. He stated that he has taken responsibility in the ways that matter most to him and those directly involved. He said that public debate sometimes simplifies deeply personal situations. One of the other co-hosts attempted humor again, lightly suggesting that live television might not be the best place for therapy-level conversations. The comment drew nervous laughter from parts of the audience. But Sunny pressed one final time in this initial exchange, asking whether avoiding specifics contributes to skepticism from the public. It was not accusatory in tone, but it was undeniably direct. And that is the moment when the temperature at the table noticeably changed. Brad's jaw tightened. He exhaled audibly into his microphone, not dramatically, but enough to be heard. He said he believed the conversation was veering into territory that felt unfair given the context of the visit. The word unfair seemed to land heavily. There was a pause, longer than most daytime television pauses allow. Producers in the control room likely weighed whether to cut to commercial. The hosts looked at one another briefly, each calculating how to proceed. The segment had started as routine. It had slowly built into something much more serious. And while no one had raised their voice, the tension was now undeniable. Viewers at home were likely leaning forward, sensing that the exchange was no longer scripted, no longer predictable. Brad adjusted his seat. Sunny maintained eye contact. And the conversation, still live, was about to escalate further. The pause that followed felt longer than it probably was in real time, but on live television, even a few seconds of silence can stretch noticeably. The camera stayed wide enough to capture the full table, which meant viewers could see every small reaction, the tightened posture, the exchanged glances, the subtle adjustments in expression.
No one was smiling now.
Brad leaned slightly forward again, resting his forearms on the table. His voice remained controlled, but there was a shift in tone, less conversational, more deliberate. He said that while he respects thoughtful questions, he came on the show to discuss his current work and broader themes connected to it. He added that when personal matters are brought into a promotional segment, it can create an imbalance, especially when the individuals directly involved aren't present to speak for themselves. Sunny listened without interrupting. She nodded once, then responded calmly. She said that part of the responsibility of a platform like theirs is to reflect the questions viewers are already asking. She emphasized that the audience isn't disconnected from the broader conversation happening outside the studio. Her voice remained even, but her wording was clear. Public figures operate within a public dialogue. At that point, another co-host stepped in, attempting to mediate. She acknowledged that these conversations are complicated and suggested reframing the discussion around how people rebuild trust in the public eye. It was a visible effort to cool the temperature without dismissing the substance of what had just been raised. Brad responded to that reframing more comfortably. He spoke about rebuilding trust through consistent action rather than statements. He said that over time, actions speak more loudly than interviews ever could. His shoulders relaxed slightly as he spoke in more general terms. But Sunny returned to the specific issue of transparency. She clarified that when public figures discuss growth, audiences often want clarity about what that growth looks like. She was careful not to use inflammatory language. Her tone remained professional, almost clinical, but the directness of her approach continued to hold the tension in the room. The audience was quiet again. Unlike earlier applause moments, there were no immediate reactions. People were listening carefully. Brad's expression shifted from controlled calm to visible frustration, not explosive, but present. He stated that there's a difference between accountability and public dissection. He explained that certain legal and family matters are sensitive and involve children, and that he has intentionally kept details private to protect them. That mention of children subtly changed the emotional dynamic. A few audience members murmured softly. The co-host seated closest to him offered a brief nod of empathy. Sunny responded by acknowledging that protecting family is important. She then posed a broader question. Does public silence sometimes create more speculation? It was framed as a general observation rather than a personal accusation, but the context was clear. Brad inhaled slowly before answering. He said speculation exists regardless of what one says publicly. He added that speaking in fragments or partial explanations can sometimes make things worse. He reiterated that the most meaningful conversations happen privately, not through headlines. The back and forth, while still civil, had developed a sharper edge. Each response was slightly more clipped than the last. The host's usual conversational overlap, light interruptions, shared laughter, had disappeared. Instead, there was a careful, almost courtroom-like pacing to the exchange. One co-host attempted to pivot again, referencing a scene in his film that deals with redemption and reconciliation. She asked whether art provides a safer space to explore themes that are too difficult to unpack in interviews. The question felt like a bridge, not dismissing what had been discussed, but offering an alternate lane. Brad welcomed that shift. He spoke at length about storytelling as a means of processing complex human experiences. As he did, his tone softened. The audience began to relax. There were a few nods and quiet affirmations from the panel. However, Sunny, maintaining her role, circled back one more time, this time tying the artistic theme to real-world impact. She asked whether portraying redemption on-screen places additional responsibility on someone navigating real-life scrutiny. The repetition wasn't aggressive, but it was persistent. And that persistence seemed to be what finally tipped the balance. Brad paused again, but this time the pause felt heavier. He glanced briefly off camera, possibly toward a producer, or simply gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was still steady, but unmistakably firmer. He said he felt the line of questioning had become disproportionate to the context of the appearance. He reiterated that he respects dialogue but believes certain discussions deserve more nuance than a daytime panel format allows. He added that he didn't agree with the framing that public growth requires public confession. The word confession stood out. It wasn't something Sunny had said. It was his interpretation of where the conversation felt like it was heading. Sunny responded calmly that she wasn't asking for confession, but for clarity about how influential figures participate in conversations about responsibility. Her posture remained upright, hands folded lightly on the table. She did not raise her voice. At this point, the atmosphere shifted from tense to visibly strained. Brad adjusted his microphone slightly. He looked down at the table, then back up. He said, in measured terms, that he felt the interview had moved into territory he hadn't agreed to discuss, and that he preferred to redirect. One co-host quickly agreed, suggesting they pivot back to the creative work. She smiled gently, attempting to restore warmth to the table. But before the pivot could fully take hold, Sunny added one final remark, not phrased as a question, but as commentary. She stated that these conversations aren't about ambush. They're about reflecting what audiences care about. Her tone remained professional, but the underlying message was clear. The show wasn't overstepping in her view. Brad leaned back in his chair fully now. His body language had closed off slightly, arms crossing loosely before he uncrossed them again. He said quietly but audibly that he disagreed with that characterization. The studio audience shifted audibly in their seats. There was no applause, no laughter. Just the ambient awareness that this was no longer a standard interview. The moderator of the panel stepped in decisively. She thanked Brad for his honesty and acknowledged that live conversations can be unpredictable. She attempted to summarize both perspectives, the importance of dialogue and the importance of boundaries. As Brad shifted in his chair and placed his earpiece on the table, the shift in the room became unmistakable. There is a particular kind of silence that falls in a live studio when something unscripted happens, not chaotic, not loud, but deeply attentive. That was the atmosphere now. He didn't stand abruptly. There was no dramatic gesture. Instead, he placed both hands on the table, pushed his chair back slowly, and rose in a controlled, deliberate motion. His expression was not angry in a theatrical sense. It was firm, composed, and clearly resolved. He gave a brief nod toward the moderator and said calmly, "I think I'm going to step away from this one." The wording mattered. He didn't accuse. He didn't attack. But he was drawing a line. Immediately, the moderator leaned forward, her tone shifting into de-escalation mode. She thanked him for being there and suggested they could move to commercial and reset. Her voice carried that practiced steadiness that daytime hosts rely on when something veers off course. Sunny remained seated, posture straight, hands resting lightly on the table. She did not interrupt him as he stood. Her expression was serious, but not confrontational. From a viewer's perspective, it was clear she did not anticipate him physically leaving the table. The exchange had been tense, yes, but still within the bounds of serious talk show debate. Until that moment. As Brad adjusted his jacket, the audience reaction began to ripple. A few people clapped hesitantly, unsure whether to show support or simply fill the silence. Others remained completely quiet, watching closely. One of the co-hosts attempted to lighten the moment again, offering a gentle, "We appreciate you coming," but her voice carried a noticeable strain. Live television leaves no room for rehearsal in moments like this. Brad gave a brief acknowledgement toward the panel as a whole. He did not make direct eye contact with Sunny in that moment. Instead, he looked toward the moderator and said, "Thank you," before turning slightly toward the side exit used by guests. The cameras followed him only briefly. Producers clearly made a decision not to dramatize the departure visually. Within seconds, the shot returned to the full table. Now the focus was entirely on the hosts. The moderator took control quickly, thanking viewers and acknowledging that live conversations sometimes unfold in unexpected ways. Her tone was calm, steady, and professional. She reiterated that the show values open dialogue but also respects guest boundaries. Sunny spoke next. Her voice was measured and even. She stated that her questions were intended to reflect ongoing public conversations and that accountability discussions are part of modern media interviews. She did not apologize, but she did clarify her intent. The audience reaction to her statement was mixed. A small section applauded. Others remained quiet. That split reaction was subtle, but visible. Another co-host stepped in, emphasizing that the show often engages in challenging discussions and that disagreement doesn't equal hostility. It was a careful attempt to contextualize the moment without assigning fault. From a viewer's perspective, what stood out most was how restrained everyone remained. There were no raised voices, no personal attacks. The tension came from the contrast between expectation and outcome, a promotional interview turning into a live walk-off. The moderator then made the call to go to commercial. The transition music played slightly earlier than scheduled, and the camera faded out. For viewers watching live at home, the break likely felt abrupt. Social media, however, began reacting almost immediately. Clips of the moment, particularly the removal of the earpiece and the calm declaration that he would step away, began circulating within minutes. When the show returned from commercial, the energy at the table was notably different. The panel had clearly used the break to regroup. The moderator addressed the situation directly, acknowledging that the conversation had ended sooner than planned. She emphasized that the show encourages honest dialogue and that guests are free to set boundaries. Her framing avoided blame while reinforcing the program's editorial independence. Sunny spoke again, this time in a slightly more reflective tone. She explained that her role as a journalist includes asking difficult questions. She added that discomfort does not necessarily mean disrespect. Her phrasing was careful, grounded in principle rather than emotion. Another co-host expressed appreciation for the audience's patience and shifted the discussion toward a broader topic: how live television captures real human reactions in ways pre-recorded interviews cannot. The studio audience, sensing that the segment had concluded, responded with polite applause. It wasn't enthusiastic, but it was supportive of the host's composure. What became increasingly clear as the post-walk-off discussion unfolded was that no one on the panel appeared flustered. There was tension, certainly, but there was also professionalism. The hosts maintained their roles. The show continued. Meanwhile, viewers online were already debating what had just happened. Some argued that Sunny's questions were fair and rooted in public accountability. Others felt the setting, a daytime talk show, was not appropriate for revisiting deeply personal matters. Back in the studio, the moderator transitioned into the next scheduled segment, signaling that the show would not dwell excessively on the departure. The shift felt intentional: acknowledge, contextualize, move forward. Yet the atmosphere remained slightly subdued for the rest of the broadcast. Even lighter segments carried a trace of the earlier tension. The audience laughter during subsequent discussions was present, but more measured. For those who had watched the exchange unfold from the beginning, the escalation felt gradual rather than explosive. There was no shouting match, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, it was a steady build, a difference in expectations about the scope of the conversation. Brad had come prepared to discuss his work and perhaps broader themes of growth. Sunny had come prepared to connect that growth to public accountability. Neither position was extreme. But in live television, nuance can become friction when timing and tone intersect imperfectly. As the show neared its conclusion, the moderator briefly referenced the earlier moment once more, thanking viewers for engaging thoughtfully and reminding them that the show values diverse perspectives. The audience applauded again, this time more fully, perhaps signaling appreciation for the panel's handling of an unscripted situation. By the time the credits rolled, what remained wasn't outrage or chaos. It was a question about boundaries, about journalistic responsibility, and about how far a promotional interview should go when public controversy lingers in the background. And as the cameras cut off and the studio lights dimmed, one thing was certain: the conversation that began calmly at the table would not end there. By the time the live broadcast concluded, the immediate tension inside the studio had settled into something quieter, more reflective. The hosts remained at the table for a few moments after the cameras stopped rolling, speaking briefly among themselves and with producers. From the audience's perspective, there was no visible chaos. Staff members moved calmly. The hosts maintained professional composure. But it was clear that everyone understood something significant had just occurred. Within minutes of the episode ending on the East Coast feed, short clips began circulating online. The most widely shared moment was not a raised voice or a sharp comment, because there hadn't been one. It was the subtle removal of the earpiece and the calm statement, "I think I'm going to step away from this one." Viewers described the moment as restrained but powerful precisely because it lacked theatrics. Commentary quickly divided into two general perspectives. One side argued that Sunny's line of questioning reflected the evolving expectations placed on public figures. In today's media environment, audiences often expect celebrities to address past controversies directly, even during promotional appearances. From that viewpoint, the questions were measured, relevant, and part of responsible journalism. The other side felt that the setting, a daytime talk show known for blending entertainment with discussion, was not the appropriate venue for probing deeply into personal matters, especially those involving family. Supporters of Brad's decision emphasized his repeated references to privacy and protecting children from public scrutiny. As the afternoon progressed, entertainment news outlets began reporting on the exchange. Headlines focused on the walk-off, but many analysts noted how controlled the disagreement had been. There was no shouting match, no visible hostility. What made the moment notable was its quiet firmness. Later that day, representatives for Brad released a brief statement. The wording was concise and diplomatic. It explained that he had agreed to appear to discuss his current film project and broader artistic themes. The statement reiterated his respect for open dialogue but emphasized his long-standing commitment to keeping certain family matters private. There was no direct criticism of the show and no inflammatory language. Shortly afterward, the show addressed the situation on its social media platforms. A post thanked Brad for appearing and affirmed the program's commitment to asking thoughtful questions that reflect public conversation. The tone was measured and professional, avoiding escalation. The following morning, the panel revisited the moment briefly during their opening segment. The moderator framed the recap as part of a broader conversation about live television and boundaries. She explained that interviews are often guided by mutual expectations, but can evolve organically. Her tone suggested reflection rather than defensiveness. Sunny spoke candidly but calmly. She stated that her questions were not meant to provoke a walk-off, but to explore themes of accountability and growth that resonate with viewers. She emphasized that difficult questions are part of her journalistic approach, especially when discussing public figures whose personal narratives intersect with cultural conversations. Another co-host offered a complimentary perspective, acknowledging that guests may feel unprepared for certain directions in interview takes. She suggested that communication before segments is key and that sometimes live dynamics simply unfold differently than planned. What stood out in that follow-up discussion was the absence of blame. No one characterized the moment as explosive or disrespectful. Instead, it was framed as an example of the complexity of balancing entertainment with serious dialogue. Meanwhile, public reaction continued to build. Media commentators on various networks debated whether celebrities should expect hard questions even during promotional stops. Some pointed out that talk shows today operate differently than they did decades ago. The lines between journalism, commentary, and entertainment have blurred. Others argued that daytime audiences tune in for conversation that feels human and nuanced, not confrontational. They suggested that viewers may feel divided when a segment shifts abruptly from creative discussion to unresolved controversy. Throughout the discourse, one theme kept resurfacing: tone. Observers noted that the disagreement never became loud or hostile. It was a clash of expectations more than personalities. Brad maintained composure throughout. Sunny maintained composure throughout. The tension came from persistence meeting resistance in real time. In interviews conducted later in the week, industry insiders described how live programming requires constant split-second decisions. Producers must weigh the value of letting a conversation unfold naturally against the risk of losing a guest. In this case, they allowed the exchange to continue longer than some might have predicted, perhaps trusting that it would remain civil. From a viewer's perspective, what lingered wasn't anger, but discomfort. Not because of shouting, but because of the visible moment when a guest decided that the conversation no longer aligned with his boundaries. Body language experts even weighed in across morning news segments. They noted Brad's gradual posture changes, from relaxed and open at the beginning of the interview to more closed and guarded as the questioning continued. They also observed Sunny's steady eye contact and composed delivery, interpreting it as confidence in her line of inquiry. The broader entertainment community responded cautiously. Few public figures commented directly. Those who did emphasized the importance of respectful dialogue. No one framed the moment as scandalous. Rather, it became a case study in the challenges of modern media interviews. Inside the studio, staff reportedly conducted an internal review of the segment, not as damage control, but as routine evaluation. Live television is constantly assessed for pacing, tone, and balance. Producers likely examined whether there had been misalignment between pre-interview expectations and on-air direction. By the end of the week, the moment had settled into a quieter place within the news cycle. It was still being discussed, but without the urgency of breaking news. The footage continued to circulate, often accompanied by commentary about how calm, yet definitive the departure had been. What remained most striking was that no bridges appeared publicly burned. There were no retaliatory interviews. No escalating statements. Both sides maintained professionalism. In hindsight, many viewers described the exchange as an example of the evolving nature of celebrity interviews. Audiences expect authenticity and accountability. Guests expect reasonable boundaries. When those expectations intersect imperfectly, tension can surface, even without raised voices. And as the media conversation continued, attention began shifting toward what the moment revealed about live television itself, that unscripted interactions, even when handled calmly, can leave lasting impressions because they reflect genuine human boundaries being drawn in real time. As the week moved forward and the intensity of the initial headlines began to taper off, what remained was not a scandal, but a conversation, one that stretched beyond a single segment of daytime television. The episode itself ended without further disruption. After revisiting the moment briefly the following day, the panel transitioned back into its regular programming rhythm. Segments about current events, pop culture, and lifestyle topics resumed their usual cadence. The tone of the show felt balanced again. But for viewers who had watched the original exchange unfold live, the memory of that quiet walk-off lingered. Not because it was explosive, but because it felt real. There was no dramatic music, no raised voices, no abrupt cut to black. Just a measured disagreement that reached its limit. In the immediate aftermath of the broadcast, studio audience members who later spoke online described the atmosphere as tense but controlled. Several noted that when Brad stood up, there was confusion more than shock. Some initially thought it might be a transition to commercial or a brief reset. Only when he walked fully off stage did it become clear that the segment was ending on his terms. Audience applause, according to those present, was hesitant at first. A few claps began, then faded, then picked up again once the moderator addressed the moment directly. It wasn't celebratory applause. It was supportive, directed more toward the host's composure than the departure itself. Online, viewer reaction remained divided but thoughtful. On social media platforms, many users praised Sunny for maintaining a calm, journalistic approach. They argued that asking difficult questions, even during promotional appearances, reflects the realities of modern media. Others felt strongly that the segment should have stayed focused on the film and avoided reopening personal matters involving family and legal disputes. Interestingly, what was largely absent from the online discourse was outrage over tone. Even critics of the questioning acknowledged that it was delivered respectfully, and even supporters of Brad's decision rarely described him as angry. The consensus across commentary was that the moment was about boundaries, not hostility. In the days following, entertainment analysts highlighted how the segment demonstrated the unpredictability of live television. Unlike pre-recorded interviews that can be edited for pacing and tone, live broadcasts reveal discomfort in real time. The gradual tightening of posture, the longer pauses between answers, the subtle shift in eye contact, those details cannot be smoothed over in post-production. Some commentators also discussed how celebrity interviews have evolved over the past decade. Where promotional stops once focused almost exclusively on upcoming projects, audiences now expect public figures to address personal narratives that shape their public image. That expectation creates tension when guests and hosts approach the segment with different assumptions. Neither side publicly escalated the situation after the fact. Brad did not appear on another outlet to criticize the show. The panel did not devote extended airtime to defending their approach. The matter remained contained within that single exchange and its immediate follow-up. From a production standpoint, the show continued booking high-profile guests. There were no visible signs of fallout affecting scheduling or advertiser relationships. In fact, ratings for the episode saw a noticeable uptick in the days following the incident, driven by curiosity and replay views online. While the network did not officially frame that increase as connected to the walk-off, media analysts pointed to the spike as evidence that audiences remained drawn to unscripted authenticity. Perhaps the most meaningful takeaway came during a quieter moment later that week, when the moderator reflected generally on live conversations. She remarked that television works best when it reflects real human interaction, including moments of disagreement. She emphasized that respect can coexist with tension and that not every unresolved exchange needs to become a feud. That framing seemed to resonate with viewers. The story gradually shifted from storming off to a more accurate description, a guest deciding, calmly, that a conversation had reached his limit. Looking back at the segment from beginning to end, the escalation was gradual and almost procedural. A routine promotional interview transitioned into a deeper discussion about accountability. Follow-up questions pressed for clarity. Responses emphasized privacy and boundaries. The tension built not through aggression, but through persistence meeting resistance. The moment Brad removed his earpiece and stood up was not theatrical. It was deliberate. That deliberateness is what made it stand out. In an era where viral moments often involve raised voices or dramatic confrontations, this exchange felt different. It was quiet, controlled, and undeniably human. For viewers of daytime television, the incident served as a reminder of what makes live programming compelling. When conversations unfold without a script, participants must navigate boundaries in real time. Sometimes those boundaries align smoothly. Other times, they reveal differences in expectation. As the news cycle moved on, the clip continued circulating occasionally, often accompanied by commentary about professionalism on both sides. It became less about conflict and more about the evolving dynamics of celebrity interviews in a culture that increasingly values transparency while still grappling with the meaning of privacy. And that brings us to the larger question the moment leaves behind. How should public figures balance accountability with personal limits? And how should interviewers balance inquiry with context? There isn't a simple answer. What this exchange demonstrated is that even calm, measured dialogue can reach a breaking point when perspectives diverge. The segment ended with the show returning to its regular format, the audience applauding politely, and the hosts maintaining composure. There was no dramatic fallout. Just a brief, unscripted reminder that live television reflects real human boundaries. For those who watched it happen in real time, it felt less like a spectacle and more like witnessing a line being drawn, quietly, respectfully, and firmly. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think the questions were fair for a daytime talk show setting, or should promotional interviews stay strictly focused on the project at hand? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.